Today, we want to talk about the powers of Congress. We're going to go through the different powers that they have that are in the Constitution. We're going to interpret the powers that are in the Constitution, and we're going to talk about all the different ways that Congress has powers beyond what's just in the Constitution. What we see here, we see our three top leaders of the House of Representatives at the moment. You got Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi in the middle, her House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer on her left, your right, and on her right, your left is House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. So these three leaders come together to pass a law, and we're going to find out what kind of laws Congress can pass. So our objective today, we're going to describe the powers of Congress. That's the main thing we're going to focus on doing today. What we're going to do with this later, we're going to end up explaining all of the different interactions between these branches. And so we need to know what Congress's powers are and what things should be Congress's powers, especially when we start talking about the president, so we can start talking about the struggle between Congress and the president over making law. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to talk about what kinds of policymaking powers Congress has. So first, today we're going to take a look at interpreting the powers of Congress. And hopefully this comes across as a lot of a review to you guys, because this is going to be a lot of stuff similar to what we talked about with the Constitution in general, because we're talking about interpreting the words that are in the Constitution, and specifically today focusing on those things that deal with Congress. So hopefully a couple of powers that are familiar to you at this point, but they're the most important parts of the Constitution for us to deal with. So, for starters, this should sound familiar. We talked about strict and loose interpretation of the Constitution, but if we interpret the powers of Congress in the same way, we end up with very different versions of Congress that can do very different things. So, a strict interpretation of the Constitution meant that we want to focus only on those things that are in the Constitution. So, if I were doing that with Article 1 and with Congress's powers, then that means I'm talking about a Congress that only has the expressed powers listed in the Constitution. We're going to go through those today, but when I give you this list of things, we would consider those to be the only things Congress should be doing. That would result in a Congress that is very limited and does not have a whole lot of power. So here we would say that Congress can only do specifically what the Constitution authorizes it to do. On the other hand, loose interpretation of Congress would mean, much like loose interpretation of the Constitution, if the Constitution doesn't ban it, then that's something that Congress can do. So here we're going to say that loose interpretation of Congress's powers means that Congress can do anything that the Constitution doesn't prevent. It does prevent Congress from doing a few clear things like ex post facto laws, bills of attainder, suspending the writ of habeas corpus. But other than that, Congress should be able to do anything. So this would lead to a very powerful Congress that has a whole lot of implied powers. We're going to talk about where those implied powers come from today. So in this case, a loose interpretation of the Constitution would lead to a Congress that can do anything that the Constitution does not ban it from doing. So the first of these powers that we would interpret, I hope this is burned into your brain at this point. We've talked about a lot. Congress has the power to regulate commerce between the states. So we went through Gibbons versus Ogden. We've looked at this case before. We've looked at interpretation of the Commerce Clause. And what we know that in a modern interpretation of Congress, Congress can get involved in any economic activity if it's going to involve more than one state. Any economic activity is going to involve more than one state at this point, pretty much. So the Supreme Court has interpreted the Commerce Clause very loosely, and that's resulted in Congress with a tremendous amount of power. Almost any activity any economic activity is going to meet the interstate commerce bar. So that's going to give Congress the power to regulate any economic activity. And that is a loose interpretation of the commerce power in the Constitution. So if Congress is able to regulate any economic activity, that gives Congress the power to do all sorts of stuff that's not in the Constitution, but we can talk about that Congress has already done. The biggest example of this, a law that Congress passed in 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is based on the Commerce Clause. It bans discrimination and segregation in any place of public accommodation. So if it is a place that is serving the public, which is all business, then you can't discriminate based on race, all sorts of different other categories. You can't segregate. So even though the Constitution doesn't necessarily say that Congress can tell you how to run your business, the Commerce Clause allows Congress exactly the power to do that. So using the Commerce Clause, they can ban segregation, they can ban discrimination, they can ban all sorts of discriminatory practices of jobs. Congress, over many different times throughout the years, has set a minimum wage for the country. Currently, that minimum wage is 7.25 an hour. Uh, Sad thing, it's the same as how much it was when I was in high school for you guys. But Congress has the power to increase the minimum wage. States can make their own minimum wage laws, but the lowest a wage can be in the country is $7.25 an hour because that is a law Congress passed. Um, there's all sorts of health and safety laws about the workplace that probably impact many of you guys at your jobs. You've probably had to watch some safety videos or learn some safety information about the chemicals that are used at your jobs, especially those of you working in like a restaurant or something like that. Um, there's all sorts of safety rules, all sorts of rules about what would happen if you get hurt and things like that. Um, Congress used the Commerce Clause to ban child labor. So we don't let children work in the mines anymore or anything like that. We don't let children under 16 work. Um, and there are different hours and rules that you guys can be asked to work up until you are 18. So you've probably seen that, like part of the rules Congress makes is that these things have to be posted for you. So probably at a job that you have, you might see a poster that lets you know the minimum wage and the laws that your employer has to follow. The Commerce Clause has also allowed Congress to break up monopolies of different kinds over the years and to also make a lot of laws that have allowed in the first place and then given protections to groups like labor unions. So even though groups of workers is not something that's in the Constitution, it definitely fits under the realm of commerce. And so that is a power that Congress has to pass. The other big clause here that we're going to interpret again, hopefully a review for you, is the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause. So Congress has the power to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out the express powers. This is what we call the elastic clause. Call it elastic because it stretches each power of Congress. So in a few minutes, we'll go through all of the express powers of Congress. And for each one of those, we can use the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause to stretch that power a little bit. The example I use all the time, just because it's very easy, is it's going to tell us that Congress has the power to raise an army. Well, if they have the power to raise an army, to get an army together, and nobody wants to join the army, then maybe it's necessary for Congress to hold a military draft in order to raise that army. So we'll talk about how each express power leads to a variety of implied powers that Congress has, and that every time we talk about an implied power of Congress, it's going to go back to this interpretation of the necessary and proper clause. So Congress has all sorts of powers that it needs in order to fill out its express powers. All right, so all that is about interpreting the powers of Congress that are there. Interpretation of the powers of Congress is going to have a lot to do with how much power Congress has and what powers they'll give to the president. So we are going to spend the next few minutes going through each of those expressed powers of Congress.